when God doesn't. We are continuing with our three-part sermon series on the prophet Habakkuk. And we've been saying, when God doesn't what? Make sense. When God doesn't answer our prayers. When God doesn't seem good. Or when God doesn't deal with injustice in our world, in our nation. And we said the series purpose, which we launched last week, and it's a short prophetic literature. It's only 3 chapters, so we're looking at the entirety of the book of Habakkuk. But understand that we're looking at this book through these challenging thoughts and struggles of this prophet. While studying him, we too can get an understanding for our lives to help us through difficult and challenging moments when we have questions like that, or we struggle with when a God doesn't seem to make sense, or God doesn't seem to deal with injustice in this world. And last week, when we launched the series, and you're able to go on our website or social media to be able to if you missed a message, to go watch that or see it, to understand. We looked at last week in part 1, why do you tolerate wrongdoing? And we had this prophet, which we said was more like a diary, really, than just prophetic literature, like we looked at for all those weeks in Ezekiel. We see this prophet who is like coming to the Lord with complaints. And he got an answer from the Lord. And it's interesting, though, that we, and I think prophet was, a little surprised by the answer that he received from God, or his sovereignty about how God rules over all nations. And to understand that when God doesn't, God wouldn't deal with the wrongdoing, he would deal with the wrongdoing of his people, because that was Habakkuk's complaint, that the people of Israel were so rebellious against God and living wicked lives, and God said, I'll take care of their wickedness. Yeah, and we like that when injustice is taken care of, but he said, I'm going to do it with more wicked people, or greater wrongdoers, and that was the Babylonians. And that, I would think, as an answer that he received, I wonder how that was received. Because we move into part 2, as we look at the rest of chapter 1 and the entirety of chapter 2. Why do you tolerate the wicked? Calling customer service again. Have you ever had to call customer service or a complaint department? Because something's wrong. And what we're about to see today is Habakkuk calling God again, because it seems like he didn't like his answer. And so he calls the complaint department. Anybody like to call customer service? And here's the thing. This is important to kind of think about, too. We don't just randomly, hopefully you don't, just pick up your phone and start calling companies to complain about them. Usually you call with a complaint when it has an impact on you. If I don't have a phone through Verizon, I surely wouldn't call Verizon with a complaint. I would call AT&T or another one, or Sprint or something like that. I would call the one that impacts me. And I think what you get a greater sense here, and I think this is for the people of God today, the complaint department that Habakkuk was to God, because he belonged to God. And he lifted up his concerns. But he complained once, but didn't like the answer. You ever call customer service and the answer they give you is something you don't like? Yeah, and then if you don't like the answer you get from the person you're speaking with, what do you usually say? Let me talk to your manager, right? And then, please hold. And they put you on hold and they go get the manager. But the thing is, Habakkuk as the prophet starts with God. And if he didn't like the answer he got from God, what did the prophet do? Let me speak to your manager? He didn't necessarily like the answer, but what we see today is another complaint. He calls up God again. And what you're going to see here in the rest of chapter 1 is the second complaint. And it goes like this. Lord, are you not from everlasting? My God, my Holy One, you will never die. You, Lord, have appointed them to execute judgment. You, my rock, have ordained them to punish. Your eyes are too pure to look on evil. Now he's starting to get to this God who can't be around wrongdoing or wickedness. Your eyes are too pure to look on evil. You cannot tolerate wrongdoing. Why then do you tolerate the treacherous? Asking God this. Why are you silent while the wicked swallow up those more righteous than themselves? Remember, again, going back to the Babylonians who are more wicked than the nation of Israel, and they're going to swallow up God's people? What's up with that, God? Verse 14, you have made people like the fish in the sea, like the sea creatures that have no ruler. The wicked foe pulls all of them up with hooks. He catches them in his net. He gathers them up in his dragnet, and so he rejoices and is glad. Therefore, he sacrifices to his net and burns incense to his dragnet, for by his net he lives in luxury and enjoys the choicest foods. Is he to keep on emptying his net, destroying nations without mercy? Now, I want you to hear this part in chapter 2. I will stand, this is the prophet saying to God, at my watch, and station myself on the ramparts. I will look to see what he will say to me, and what answer I am to give to this complaint. Well, let's stop there for a moment, because that was his complaint. How do you think it went? How do you think it sounded to God? Hearing that complaint, let him have it. Don't we do that when we call customer service sometimes? We let them have it because we've felt some injustice or problem wrong to us. We're being overcharged for something. Our phones don't work right. Our cable is not right. I can't watch the big game. And you call and you complain. And I like, you have to be honest, Habakkuk's kind of approach. He starts calling out those things he knows about God. Hey! You're an everlasting. You're an everlasting God. That's your nature, God. It's almost like he's trying to butter him up. You ever try and do that when you call to complain? I just love my service through Verizon. No one says that. I'm just joking. But you try and butter him. This is what his approach is. He's trying to say these things like the everlasting nature of God. And he goes on to say, look, God, I heard your first answer, but take this into consideration. You're the one who says you don't tolerate wrongdoing. Did you hear me, God? You're going to send these unrighteous, these wicked people, the Babylonians, to correct our problems? That doesn't make sense. How can you tolerate more wrongdoing on our wrongdoing? That doesn't make any sense. Starting to call God into question again. How dare you use the wicked to swallow up our problems? And he called the complaint department. But now this is important. How many of you hang up after you lay out your complaint and not wait for an answer? Nobody. And yet, this is the approach that some people take with God. We complain about the injustices of the world. Worse yet, we complain about our problems to the Lord, or we let everyone else hear about our problems, and we refuse to wait for an answer from God. We hang up. I'm going to tell you about how much I hate myself, and boom, and hang up the phone. But what I want you to see here from this prophet is a good method for all of ourselves. Don't hang up. And what does he say there in chapter 2, verse 1? I will stand at my watch and station myself on the ramparts. I mean, I'm going to wait till I get an answer. I'm going to wait, God, till I get an answer from you. That's what he says to the Lord. Now, here's a question with all of us. How long are you willing, please hold, for God? Because have you ever done that when you call with a complaint? And after you've complained, the person says, please hold. And then you go to that beautiful music they always have playing for you in the background. And then you hear this recording, right, after you've been holding for 10 minutes. Your call is very important to us. Please continue to hold. 20 minutes after you've heard it already 3 or 4 times. Please hold. Your call is important to us. And after a while of holding for a while, you say, I'm tired of holding, because your call doesn't seem important My call doesn't seem important to you at all. Let me just say this. Take this same approach with God. The thing with God is often you can lay out a complaint or you see some injustice or problem in the world, and then as you cry out to the Lord, it's difficult to hear from the Lord. Please hold. Wait. Anyone else struggle with that? Yeah, because I know you don't like you all were giggling and laughing when I was talking about with Verizon or Xfinity or some other place. But what is it with God that allows us to see that to happen to us too? That in the cries that we have, like this prophet, we don't like to be told by God, please hold. Please wait on me. Oh, that's a hard one. Well, let's see what the Lord's answer is, shall we? We're in chapter 2, verse 2, the Lord's answer. Then the Lord replied, write down the revelation and make it plain on tablets so that a herald may run with it. For the revelation awaits an appointed time. It speaks of the end, and look at this, and will not prove false. Though it linger, look at this, wait for it. Please hold. Wait for it. And then he goes on, it will certainly come. And then he goes, and will not delay. See, the enemy is puffed up. His desires are not upright. But the righteous person will live by his faithfulness. Listen to that part again. But the righteous person will live by his faithfulness. Then he goes back to those that are puffed up, the enemy, the Babylonians. Indeed, wine betrays him. He is arrogant and never at rest, because he is greedy as the grave, and like death is never satisfied. He gathers to himself all the nations and take captive all the peoples. Now we'll stop right there as part of God's response, because it's very interesting that he is told to write this down. That this is a message that, now this is where the first thing we have, where Habakkuk will have to go out to be an actual prophet. He's given this message to proclaim it in the square. Herald it, to shout it out. And remember what we said last week, that the Babylonians aren't yet a superpower. So the message he has to have of what's to happen to correct the problems in the nation will look crazy to some people, but yet that's the message he has to shout out. Or a better way of saying it is make it go viral. That we understand today, right? Make this message, Habakkuk, go viral to the people so they hear the message once again. Let everyone hear it to prove what? God is not wrong. And it seems crazy because he has to say the message, and then there's this long waiting, holding for God to enact this justice. Oh, we struggle with the waiting and God's revelation. And I think about this because he says, look, it awaits an appointed time. It speaks of the end. Now, when I read that, I couldn't help but think of the end times that we are looking towards, and the saying about God is coming again in the book of Revelation, an appointed time. It speaks of the end of all things. And we hold our hope to what? And then he goes on to say, and will not prove false. Let me just say this. If the revelation that was given to Habakkuk, this prophet, and everything played out where the Babylonians came and conquered the people and took them away, what do you think the odds are that in the book of Revelation, when God talks about the end times, that what he says is going to come true? But please wait. Please hold. And sometimes it's difficult, even as a pastor, to have to, preach these messages to people because you're like, oh, it's never going to happen in my lifetime. Please hold. How do we know when this is going to take place? So let's go to something else here. Scholars agree here on a God-centered message. You get to chapter 2. Remember, it's only 3 chapters long. And scholars kind of break out the layout of this book. And remember what we said last week. Even gave a spoiler alert for this. That Habakkuk had all these complaints to God. Right? He's complaining, but yet, when we get to chapter 3, it's like everything changes. Scholars point to this part in chapter 2 where God's centered message is given, and they believe it is here where Habakkuk changes. Now, all the Halloween candy you have in your house, if you didn't have a ton of trick-or-treaters come your way, I got a big old bag of candy, and not many people showed up. And so that means the leftover candy stays in my house, and I eat the candy. Tootsie Pops. How many licks does it take to get to the center of a Tootsie Pop? Now, when I was a kid on Saturday mornings, I watched this commercial it's an old commercial. It gives my age. In fact, my son even said I look like a grandpa today in my sweater. Sorry, Caleb. I was trying to go for a cooler, hipper look. I don't know. But anyway, so a God-centered message is given here. It's something that I remember when I was a kid was this commercial. And the reason I picked this commercial or thought of it, one, was eating Halloween candy, all the leftover candy. But two, there's this wise owl up on the tree. And this little boy comes with his sucker. And he says, how many licks does it take to get to the center of the Tootsie Pop? And he goes, 1, 2, 3. There it is. 3 licks. But you know, if you eat a Tootsie Pop, it takes more than 3 licks to get to the center. He bites down on it. And this is something in the center of this short book we need to bite down on, because this is where we get to the center of God's message here. It's even kind of hard because you're going to see the rest of chapter 2 is complaining and talking about the Babylonians. He drops this partial one verse, and in the Spirit of God, Habakkuk hears it. And he believes this is the ooey gooey center of what God was trying to get to the prophet. Look what he says. This is God saying this. See, the enemy is puffed up. Around this world, there are so many people that are puffed up, and their desires of our enemies are not upright. But look at this. But the righteous person will live by his faithfulness. What does that mean? How do we live by his faithfulness? The Old Testament scholar, a wise old owl, up in his tree says, McConneville, he says this, the Greek Old Testament, the Septuagint, that's what the LXX looks like. That's basically saying the Old Testament, which we know is written in Hebrew, was at one point translated into Greek. And the Greek translation of the Old Testament, or the Masoretic text, was translated in the Septuagint. That's what LXX stands for. Doesn't that sound scholarly? Am I sounding smart? All right, so look, has the righteous shall live by, look at this, my faithfulness. That is God's. This makes good sense. In this context, it would mean this. In spite of the present crisis, look at this. God will save because he, meaning God, is faithful. That's important. Because in the midst of his, through it all moments, remember we talked about this with the prophet last week, that this is a political turmoil for him too. Wow. That there's changes in leadership in that nation as well. And he's seeing all the wickedness and unrighteous behaviors that are going on. And God comes to him in one small verse and says this to him, in spite of the present crisis, Habakkuk, God will save. Because of whose faithfulness? His faithfulness. God will save. That seems to change. That's the big crunch moment for this prophet. Because after this, we hear the rest of chapter 2 and the Lord's response to the wickedness of Babylon. Oh, but next week, spoiler alert, where do we get to hear Habakkuk's prayer in all of this? And this is not just an Old Testament thing. Some people say, I don't read the Old Testament. This very verse that seems to be central, or the center gooiness for Habakkuk, is one that's also preached in the New Testament. You can write these down on the back of your sermon aids. Romans 1:17, Galatians 3:11, and Hebrews 10:38. All bring this very sense up. But the righteous person will live by God's faithfulness. It's something for us, too. It speaks to the church today, in the midst of whatever crisis you may be going through. Will it change anything for you? Will you hear anything from the Lord? And it's characterized by trust in God and his promises. Look, so, and it results in, look at this, action consistent with faith. Because what we get from a response of hearing the complaints, I think Habakkuk went to the right place. He went to God, hears from the Lord, sticks around, hears the answer, and then he understands. And then what comes out of him, his action, is with faith in God. When God doesn't, we say this title of the sermon series, when God doesn't want you to act inconsistent with your identity in him. How are you acting today? Now let's look at this before we finish up today, describing the 5 woes. Are you ready to hold on to this? The 5 woes to those whose actions are not in him. This is referring to the Babylonians now. Let's take a look at some of this as we look through this. Now, will not all of them, even the Babylonians, taunt him with ridicule and scorn, saying, woe, number 1, to him who piles up stolen goods and makes himself wealthy by extortion. How long let this go on? Will not your creditors suddenly arise? Will they not wake up and make you tremble? Then you will become their prey, because you have plundered many nations. The peoples who are left will plunder you, for you have shed human blood. You have destroyed lands and cities and everyone in them. Woe, number 2, to him who builds his house by unjust gain, setting his nest on high to escape the clutches of ruin. You have plotted the ruin of many peoples, shaming your own house and forfeiting your life. The stones of the wall will cry out, and the beams of the woodwork will echo it. Woe, number 3, to him who builds a city with bloodshed and establishes a town by injustice. Has not the Lord Almighty determined that the people's labor is only fuel for the fire, that the nations exhaust themselves for nothing? For the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. Woe, number 4, to him who gives drink to his neighbors, pouring it from the wineskin till they are drunk, so that he can gaze on their naked bodies. You'll be filled with shame instead of glory. Now it is your turn. Drink, and let your nakedness be exposed. The cup from the Lord's right hand is coming around to you, and disgrace will cover your glory. The violence you have done to Lebanon will overwhelm you, and your destruction of animals will terrify you. For you have shed human blood. You have destroyed lands and cities and everyone in them. Of what value is an idol carved by a craftsman, or an image that teaches lies? For the one who makes it trusts his own creation. He makes idols that cannot speak. And number 5, woe to him who says to wood, come to life, or to lifeless stone, wake up. Can it give guidance? It is covered with gold and silver. There is no breath in it. The Lord is in his holy temple. Let all the earth be silent before him. Uh-oh. Question for all of you. As the people of God, if you are just visiting here and you're not a child of God, you can ignore this. But I do ask all of you to consider this. How would you describe your actions this past week relative to what you saw going on in our nation? Uh-oh. Politics? Some of you may have been expressing fear and doubt and struggling. Some of you may have joy and elation over what happened in our nation this past week. And some of you, by the way, if you don't know this as a church, you think we're all blue or you think we're all red. I say we're a purple congregation. We're a good mixture of both in this place. I'm okay with that. In fact, some people even said, how come you didn't get all bent out of shape this week, Pastor Mark, over the election results? Can I just give you a little help with something? As a man who identifies with the Lord, I put my trust in him and him alone. What are you putting your trust in, people? People of God. Your identity is found in him. Look to him in your actions and the way you behave. Throughout the Old Testament, you know where Habakkuk was. All these kings, in God's people, he would raise up a king. multiple kings. Some of those kings, look at this, did evil in the eyes of the Lord. Some of those kings did right in the eyes of the Lord. Some of them did right, some of them did wrong, but yet there was still God's people among them. And I remember in my seminary classes, my Old Testament professor, Dr. Dorsey, who I have a tremendous amount of respect for. He said often people will sit there and shout at the leaders. And I said, yeah, wouldn't it seem unfair? And I'm going with my complaint to my professor saying, doesn't it seem unfair that God would give a wicked ruler? Because not everybody in that nation could have been wicked. I mean, he had prophets there, right? And I struggle with that. And then the professor kindly looked at me, the scholar that he was, and lovingly he said, Mark, sometimes God gives leaders and nations to what the people deserve. Ooh. And I struggled with that a little bit because you can't control about necessarily who's in your nation. Oh, you get one vote out of millions. How much difference can I make? Until I realize my identity is in Christ and I live for Him. So whether you think there's an evil guy leading our nation or whether you think he's a good guy, you should be living your life for Him and through Him because He is a God you can trust and put your trust in. I'll close with this story. No one likes talking about politics. You can call the complaint department. You know what I'll tell you? Please hold. I have this story that I found in Tim Hansel's book, Holy Sweat. Holy Sweat. It was a book written in 1987. And Tim tells this beautiful story about him and his son, little Zach. And they went out in the country, climbing around in some cliffs. And I heard a voice from above me yell out, "Hey, Dad, catch me." And the boy jumps. I turned around to see Zach joyfully jumping off a rock straight at me. He had jumped and then yelled, "Hey, Dad!" It became, as Tim said, an instant circus act trying to catch this boy from going over yet an even greater cliff. And they ended up both falling to the ground. And for a moment, the dad, after he called him, he could barely talk because he realized how dangerous that was, how scary that was. That the two of them could have went off even a greater cliff than died. And when he finally was able to speak, he looked at his son and he said, "Zach, can you give me one good reason why you did that?" The little boy responded with remarkable calmness. And I would encourage all of you to respond the same way. And he said, "Sure, because you're my dad." "Sure, because you're my dad." His whole assurance was based in the fact that his father was trustworthy. You as a child of God, if you call out to him, "Hey, Dad," do you believe He's able to catch you and free you from your fear and your doubt and your concern? Do you believe God can be trusted? Do you believe God can be trusted? This should probably be even more true for every child of God. A little poem that I found this week too, source unknown, said, "Trust Him when dark doubts assail thee. Trust Him when thy strength is small. Trust Him when to simply trust Him seems the hardest thing of all. Trust Him. He is ever faithful. Trust Him, for His will is best. Trust Him, for the heart of Jesus is the only place of rest." Your identity as a child of God is found in Him. In Him. And I love that message. But for the righteous person, will live by his faithfulness. How you living? How you living? By your own faithfulness or by God's? Trust God. Today, hear his voice and let him change your heart for the days that you walk with him. Would you pray with me, please? Father, we thank you from your holy word with its challenges and sometimes with your response of holding and waiting for you. I pray for those, God, who are holding and waiting for you to stand firm. As the prophet said on the rampart, he'll wait for an answer. Give them the patience and courage to wait. But also give us the trust, like little Zach today. Wherever we are, the things that seem to be scary around us, or we have fears, or we have doubts, or we have concerns. Hey, Dad, catch me. Catch your children today, O Lord. And may they find a new place of trusting you now and always. Amen.